First of all, welcome to Policy Exchange. This is the first event I'm chairing. I'm the progressive new boy at Policy Exchange. I've coming up to 25 years in the city, so I'm going to look after financial policy here. And of course, one of the first things we were going to look at anyway was reforming executive compensation. It's obviously been given a hard push forward by what's going on in the political arena at the moment. We are going to be producing our own document over the next couple of months where we're going to go into these in quite a lot of detail. And in particular, one of the things we feel very strongly about, and I know Matt's going to touch on this in a few minutes, is this whole design of rewards for success and not failure. And in particular, we feel that there's too many free options out there, and there should be a clawback for executives that actually do fail, and that people shouldn't be able to walk away like Sir Fred Goodwin did, or the CEO of Thomas Cook. If you do fail, there should actually be costs to that, but that's the direction our research is taking, but more on that later on. I'm pleased to say we've got a great panel today. Matt Hancock, many of you will know, MP for West Suffolk, former Chief of Staff to George Osborne, and he's very much led the debate amongst MPs on executive compensation. We had around discussions with him, and I think it is this real focus on ending rewards for failure, which is the main sort of focus here. Matt wrote a very interesting piece in the Times earlier this week on that. So Matt's going to go first and probably speak for about 15 minutes. Then we've got Zoe Gam from the High Pay Commission, who put that very interesting report out before Christmas that very much highlighted the fact that there was widening gaps between average pay levels and executive compensation levels, which I think they wanted to cap. And secondly, talked about putting employee representatives on board. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that, but you can put the case for that. And then Alistair Heath, the editor of CCAM, well known for his forthright views, both in defending the city, but also in putting a case for reform. And noted this week, CCAM is both backs the Prime Minister in giving powers to shareholders to cap or at least control compensation, but also debunking the myth of corporate cronyism and everybody sitting on everybody else's board. So I'm sure we're going to have a very good debate. So probably 15 minutes from Matt, 10 minutes from Zoe and from Alistair, and then we're going to have questions from Matt.
James, thank you very much. I think that it is a tribute to Policy Exchange and to the direction that Neil is taking Policy Exchange that he's managed to attract such heavyweights as yourself into each of the different policy areas that Policy Exchange is working on. And James and I have been talking about ideas like these for many years now. And it's a real pleasure to see you in the policy arena working directly on the future of policy. So I'm very pleased to be here and to talk on this topic. It's been called something for nothing, or economists call it rent extraction. I call it rewards for failure. It's this problem that's can turn society against the source of its prosperity. It harms the economy, and it's unethical. And I argue that now is the time that it needs a solution. Let me set out some facts. Between 2000 and 2007, the value of FTSE 100 companies measured by market cap grew by 10%. But over the same time, the bonuses to executives trebled. Last year, FTSE 100 directors' total earnings rose on some measures by 49%, on a median measure by 14%, both of them much higher than the change in share prices. Then there's individual examples. Adam Applegarth took Northern Rock from being a successful building society to being the first British bank run in 150 years. And he left with a £760,000 payoff and a cut price staff mortgage. We all know of Sir Fred Goodwin with his pension, which gave the new meaning to the phrase, he got off scot-free. It's not just high finance. Fabio Capello is still there as England manager, despite our woeful performance in the World Cup. after a release clause was removed from his contract just before the World Cup. And these examples of rewards for failure, I think, are part of a broader something-for-nothing culture that grew up in our welfare system, in parts of the public sector, and in some of our boardrooms too. Now, I'm all in favour of people who work hard and who are successful being richly rewarded. But rewards for failure are bad ethics and bad economics. And I want to make the argument on both counts, on economics and on the ethics, that rewards for failure need to be addressed, and that addressing rewards for failure runs deep in the conservative tradition. From Peel's decision to repeal the Corn Laws to Margaret Thatcher's battle to end taxpayer support for unproductive industries. Indeed, it was David Cameron who's led on this agenda of corporate responsibility for many years in opposition, and it's very welcome more recently to see Ed Miliband also engage on the subject. But for years, the government under Labour failed to act, afraid as they were of upsetting the Faustian pact that they'd entered into to let the banks rip and spend the tax revenues. And we all know how that ended. Now, some people say that those of us on the right shouldn't talk about this subject. But on the contrary, I'd argue that it's those of us who understand the power of free markets who should be most offended when they fail. After all, the link between effort and reward forms the very basis of the market's moral authority. This is an issue of far more concern to supporters than to opponents of capitalism. And conservatives should be no more uncomfortable in tackling rewards for failure at the top as they are tackling rewards for failure at the bottom. I come here not to bury markets, but to make them work better. And it's those of us who understand free markets who are best placed, I'd say, to make these reforms. I said that there's an economic and an ethical case for action. So let me just first take the ethical case. One of the oldest political debates is about the meaning of fairness. The former government seemed to define fairness according to those bar charts that you got in the IFS Green Budget. A static sort of fairness as equality. And if you moved some people from just below to just above an arbitrary point of measurement, then they said your policy was fair. But in pursuit of this static fairness, the consequence was to undermine fairness in terms of just rewards. For most people, fairness isn't about a bar chart. Of course, there must be a safety net, but fairness is also dynamic on the principle that what you get out should accord to what you put in. And this very British understanding of fairness is the ethical basis of the free market, that those who work hard and produce things that others are willing to pay for, they prosper. Those who succeed in making others' lives, their customers' lives better, are rewarded. A system that supports these principles rewards aspiration, work, opportunity, and effort. I sometimes use the example of Apple. I don't mind that the founder of Apple died with a huge fortune, because every day he makes my life easier through his invention of the iPhone, and I imagine that the same is true for many of you here. A well-functioning market on this basis isn't amoral, it is deeply ethical on this basis of reciprocity, and conservatives understand that. But just as those who oppose markets aren't well placed to reform them, some think that we have no moral authority to intervene at all. One critic that I listened to on the Today programme, and you may have done as well, recently said that if anybody was unhappy with capitalism in Britain, then they should move to Cuba. But I don't think that's a practical answer. And as Jesse Norman has very eloquently argued, the very institutions of the free market, corporations, banks, limited liability, these themselves are in law. The question is not if the state should intervene, but how. Now, 40 years ago, Milton Friedman, that great godfather of deregulated capitalism, he wrote a famous article called "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits," blazing headline. And the article became a lodestar for those who wanted to believe that when they went to work, they should leave their conscience at the door. Not only that there is not, but that there ought not be any moral dimension to corporate behaviour. But the amoralists saw the headline, but they didn't read the argument, because Friedman made a vital caveat. He understood the crucial role of frameworks and culture in how markets operate. Here's what Friedman actually wrote. He said, "It is the social responsibility of business to make as much money as possible," that's the bit everybody knows about, "while conforming to the basic rules of society, both those embodied in law and those embodied in ethical custom." Ethical custom. So here we have the Lord High Master of free market economics making the case for ethical customs in markets. And like his disciple Margaret Thatcher, I think that Friedman would be shocked by the golden parachutes and the rewards for failure that we see today. He would see them as a violation of property rights. So the rule of law, the enforcement of contract, monopoly controls, anti-subsidy rules, insider trading, these are all crucial to well-functioning markets to ensure markets are fair so that success is linked, rewards are linked to success and not to failure. So that brings me on to the economic case. We've all heard the answer that top earners give when challenged on executive pay. They say, in a competitive global market, you've got to pay competitively to get the best talent. But the question nobody can answer for me is this. How come the same people argue that at all other pay levels, competition exerts a downward pressure, not an upward pressure, on pay? Why is there this distinction? Could it be that the performance of top managers is rising sharply? I don't think the evidence is very strong. Could it be that demand for senior bankers is outstripping supply? It's a pretty hard case to put given the state of the industry. I don't think it's even the global going rate. Chinese and Indian executives run similar sized firms, often for a fraction of the price. In fact, I looked up the pay of the CEO of the world's biggest bank. It's ICBC, based in China, and the chief exec earns $235,000 a year. I think it comes down to misaligned incentives, mostly in the form of the principal-agent problem. These misaligned incentives underpin the market failure and so the economic case for reform. Put that in plain English, the interests of the owners are misaligned from the interests of the management. And this chain from ownership to control is broken. And I want to just examine the chain to work out then what we can do about it. Firstly, the owner, mostly retail savers, often entrust their capital to a fund manager because they don't want to have to participate in the day-to-day management of their savings. The fund manager then owns then holds the shares and technically appoints the board. The board then holds the executive to account and the executive runs the company. Now, this is the case in most PLCs. Of course, there's a broad array of ownership. But I grew up in a small family business. Reward for failure was anathema. Reward was tied directly to effort. And I think that the world over, real business people don't understand why there's such a reward for failure at the very top. And if we look at a different business structure in partnerships, and especially in employee partnerships, Owners are employees too, so many of the misalignments of interest are removed. But in PLCs, this long chain of intermediation characterises, because it's in PLCs, most big companies in the UK, so I want to focus on that. At each link in the chain, I think the incentives can be repaired. And this isn't only important for the individual companies. Research by the New York Fed has shown how the wrong incentives not only harm the performance of the individual companies, but also harm the broader economy. I don't think this is much of a surprise. A strong economy rewards success, not failure. So let me take each link of the chain in turn. First, I think it's possible to look at the pay of fund managers to see how that can be reformed to reduce flat fees and to pay out more than simply following the herd, and instead more closely follow the performance for the safer. This is probably the most difficult area, and the role for government precisely, as opposed to the role for the role of industry in changing these incentives, is difficult to precisely put the finger on. Second, and this has been subject to much discussion, the shareholder power can be strengthened. For example, I very much welcome binding votes on pay. My co-author Nadeem Zahawi and I have put forward the proposal of a public protagonist to be able to challenge the views of management using the information that isn't publicly available from within the firm when presented with a proposal at an AGM. We very much welcome the progress that's been made in the past year or so on disclosure of voting by shareholders, and in particular, voting on the appointment of directors. But more shareholders need to step up to the plate. And in recognition of the fact that this isn't only about specific rules, it's about the culture. I think the actual public discourse about this, the discussion and having the Prime Minister and others talking about it, will actually change behaviour, and we're seeing more and more industry-led initiatives to strengthen the role of shareholders, and I salute, for instance, the role that the ABI has played in trying to advance that agenda. The next link of the chain is about directors. I think that the role of non-executive directors can be strengthened because technically they are the shareholders' representatives holding the executive to account. But better than complex rules would be to strengthen their accountability. After all, the best type of non-executive would be prepared to resign rather than sign off a proposal that is against the interest of the shareholders. But how often does this happen? So we should strengthen the sanctions that non-execs face if they fail to stand up for shareholders. And in the worst case, be more willing to debar directors from other directorships in the case of failure. Strengthening sanctions on directors would focus minds, and it would also mean non-executives spending more time in the company, understanding its business, asking the tough questions, and holding the executive to account. I often give the story of political agents. Technically, a political agent can go to prison if they get their returns of the expenditure around an election wrong. I've never known a political agent go to prison, but I have had that conversation both as an agent and as a candidate, where the agent says to the candidate, I'll make the decision about whether we spend that extra money on that last ad blitz, because it's my head on the block if things go wrong. And it changes the dynamic in advance, even though it never happens, or has never happened. And of course, remuneration committees are a key part of the board structure, and their role needs to be strengthened and changed, and I think that the government's proposals on this are very strong. But finally, I think direct incentives need to be brought to bear on executives themselves, and specifically in banking. I think that the history of demutualisation has led to many of the existing structures and problems. When investment banks were also partnerships, the partnerships had everything at stake. They were amply rewarded, but they were very careful with their money. But when they demutualised, the returns that had been returns both to labour and to capital, if you're an economist, or both to the management and the shareholders, those returns tended to go towards management rather than towards shareholders when those two roles were split. And I think that's at the root of a lot of the culture that has grown up since the demutualisation. So I welcome the introduction of clawback requirements into bank pay structures, and I think that the Financial Policy Committee of the Bank of England's instruction that banks should use cash to strengthen their balance sheets, not to pay out bonuses or dividends if they need to, is very important, and that policy change and the introduction of the FPC has had an impact. And then the big banks have a special responsibility. They're part of the plumbing of the financial system. They bear the responsibility of an implicit subsidy. Because when most businesses go bust, shareholders and employees take a hit, but when a systemically important bank goes bust, the whole economy is affected. And taxpayers too often have had to pick up the bill, as we know too well. Those who put our big banks at risk in this way should be held to account, just as those who destroy property or endanger the health of their fellow citizens. Sir Fred Goodwin broke one of the world's biggest banks, yet he walked away, as we all know, with a huge pension. So I want to see a law which makes it possible to prosecute executives for serious financial recklessness. One way would be to create an offence of gross negligence in valuation, where directors of the board, where directors and executives had failed effectively to value an asset or an acquisition. Executives would have a duty to perform due diligence and an obligation to disclose any information shareholders might reasonably expect to see. In the case of the RBS's board's disastrous acquisition of ABN, it's clear that due diligence was inadequate and they failed to take account of severely deteriorating market conditions at the time of the acquisition. Such omissions would become illegal under the new law. And I hope this legislation would never have to be used. But the shadow of prosecution would concentrate minds of those entrusted with these institutions of vital national importance. So our goal must be to make sure that executives think harder about the consequences of their actions and challenge the culture of finance so it's safer for us all. Tackling these rewards for failure is both morally right and economically sound, but there's one other reason too. I believe that the free market is the most powerful force of progress that's ever been invented. And we who understand that must ensure that the free market works for everyone, that all share in its success. And it is for each new generation to make this argument for freedom and for prosperity and for an economy that works for all. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I am standing in for Deborah Hargreaves, who was the chair of the High Pay Commission. I was the head of research for the project which lasted a year and unfortunately last November. We are obviously delighted to see the issue back in the headlines and delighted that the leaders of all the main parties have come out so strongly in recognition that there is an issue of concern here. What was focused on the banks has now spilled over into executive pay, and I think that, judging from what Matt very kindly said and what has been said by Cameron and others, that everyone is in agreement that there is something rotten in terms of what is going on with executive pay. Something is not working. A form of market failure has taken place. And I was very interested to hear you talk about that, Matt. So I'm going to steer clear of that discussion because I think you've done it justice. I suppose what I think is perhaps a more interesting question is what is the actual problem with executive pay? And there are three things we can think here, and I would be interested to know your conclusions. Is it that we're concerned about rewards for failure only? When you see directors of cable and wireless, for example, taking 60 million over 3 years, only to report a loss of 590 million. Or the boss of Thomas Cook paid 40 million over a number of years, while the company struggles to reschedule its debts. These are obvious examples of executives being very well rewarded, while the companies they lead struggle financially, and the shareholders that they should be accountable to suffer. The most obvious example is, again, Fred Goodwin, where it's not just the shareholders, but the general public who suffer for the failure of the executives. I think probably everyone in this room and generally will agree that rewards for failure must end. So that's the first option. The second option is, what about when pay becomes dislocated from performance? Here we're not talking necessarily about rewards for failure, we're talking about excellent rewards for mediocre performance. I was interested to hear you, Matt, mention that executive pay over the last 10 years has increased while the companies that they lead have not done so well. For example, if we look at on-target performance for an executive in the FTSE 100, a lead executive, in 2002, they could expect to receive 48% of their salary in bonus at the median. By 2010, the same level of performance, so median performance, could result in a bonus, an annual bonus of 90% of their salary. And these increases in performance-related pay have not come at the expense of salary. Over the same period, we've seen an increase in salary of 63%. And it's not just that people are receiving bigger bonuses, it's that lots and lots of executives, more executives, are receiving more of a percentage of their salary, which is growing in bonus. So, for example, in 2010, 95% of FTSE 350 lead executives received an annual bonus. I don't know the exact details of all of these companies and the exact details of why these executives received those bonuses, but it seems astonishing that 95% of companies can have done so well that all of their lead executives deserved a bonus. So is this increase in pay that we've seen related to performance? Is the increase in pay incentivising greater performance, improving our companies? Well, the total earnings for a FTSE 350 director has gone up 108% in the last 10 years. Meanwhile, pre-tax profit has gone up 50% and market cap 8%. You begin to question whether we are seeing gross escalation in executive pay, which is not necessarily rewarding failure, but it's certainly not rewarding the sort of success we want to see in our companies. What we might be seeing is executive pay growing in line with the growth of companies. So, for example, turnover has increased by 80%. Perhaps there's a closer correlation there. But then you have to ask, do we really need to pay an executive of a bigger company such a greater reward? Does that warrant greater pay, considering they'll have a bigger executive team, they will have more resources available to them in terms of making decisions for that company? These are all questions which need to be addressed. So those are the first two options. Is it reward for failure, or is it rewards unrelated or becoming dislocated to performance that we care about? Or the final option, is it pay at the top growing astronomically that we really care about? Richard Lambert, in his famous quote now, thought so. He said that when executives receive rewards which are dislocated from reality, the executives that receive them will be seen as aliens. is he right? That's an important question. The ABI, in its restated code, stated that excessive or undeserved remuneration undermines the efficient operation of a company, adversely affects its reputation, and is not aligned to shareholder interest. They clearly think that it's not just when rewards are undeserved, but also when they're excessive that there's a problem. Within firm pay inequality is associated in academic studies with lower firm performance. This may be a correlation rather than a causation. You can make up your own minds, but that is certainly the academic case. Pay inequality is part of a bundle of factors which affect employee engagement. In a survey of executives globally, 84% of respondents stated that disengaged employees are one of the 3 biggest threats that face their business. The lower echelons of employees who feel disadvantaged when they look up have a sense of injustice. This sense of injustice often makes them less supportive of the goals of the supposedly over-rewarded group and affects their engagement. If employee engagement is the secret of the success of a great company, are these big pay gaps affecting these companies' successes? I leave it up to you to make your own minds up, obviously, but at the High Pay Commission we concluded that yes, it was rewards for failure, yes, it was the fact that performance related pay was dislocated from company performance, but also that high pay in itself, when it was reaching these levels which we've seen recently, and if it continues on this trajectory, was a problem in itself. So with that in mind, the High Pay Commission put forward a set of policies, a 12-step plan to be precise, around the issues of transparency, accountability and fairness, designed to strengthen the hand of the shareholders, to make it easier and more effective for them to affect decisions on pay. And also recognising that maybe these shareholders who are increasingly dispersed, increasingly holding the shares for a shorter period of time, and increasingly themselves perhaps not as interested in remuneration as we might want them to be, recognising that we thought, the Commission thought, that you needed to include other stakeholders, which is why we put forward the proposal of having a worker representative on the Remuneration Committee. You can say that there are problems with the legal structure and will the worker be accountable, will they be financially liable, will they be a lone voice in the committee, will the decisions of the committee now take place in the corridor where they used to take place in the room? These are important questions, but the Commission ultimately concluded that the gain you would get from having a worker on the Remuneration Committee, of having someone whose sole livelihood was tied in that company, was greater than the problems you'd have to overcome to deal with it. I would be fascinated to get your questions and see how I can respond to them on that issue, and any of the issues I've discussed. And I'd like to finish there. Thank you.
Hello. Thanks for inviting me to take part in this debate. I think my position is probably quite isolated in the current debate. So I suspect I will have very little influence on what actually happens. But nevertheless, I will outline where I stand and what I think the issues at task here are. The first is what I think needs to happen is one needs reforms to make capitalism and the free market economy more efficient, not reforms to reduce inequality or to target those kinds of measures. And I think there are reforms to be had, absolutely, quite a number. But I also think the current debate is mired in some incorrect facts and misses quite a lot of the very, very complex issues that are behind all of the questions about pay and compensation and so on. First, I'll start off with the principal agent problem. It's quite clear, as economists have recognised for decades and decades and decades, is that you've got serious principal agent problems in especially large publicly listed companies with dispersed shareholders and no dominant owner. Right, everybody agrees with that. And there are reforms that you can do, both internally and also in the market for corporate control, things like takeovers and so on, to try and control that to a degree. I think myself that private equity is a superior form of corporate governance to PLCs. However, we're not going to see this appearance of PLCs anytime soon. And I'd love to point to the fact that in private equity-owned firms, there's a very good alignment of incentives between the owners and the managers. Very, very good. But there's also extremely high rewards for success. Rewards for success that are much larger even than in PLCs. So the CEO might walk away with hundreds of millions of pounds potentially for a successful private equity deal over, say, 5 years. So that's quite interesting. I'd say in some cases where shareholders are incredibly involved, they're actually willing to pay successful CEOs even more. But that's just a few of these, slightly besides the points, but nonetheless I think they sort of illustrate a few of the points here. I also think partnerships are a very efficient form of corporate governance, again more efficient than PLCs, but nevertheless they can't be expanded to the kinds of size that are required for modern multinational organisations, and there's just problems in bringing in capital and so on. So again, I think it's, while these things are quite interesting, it's quite interesting to look at those other kinds of corporate governance. They can't necessarily be measured too closely when it comes to PLCs. So, what should actually change? Well, before we actually know what needs to change, I'll just look at a few of the facts about both pay and how it's changed. It's absolutely right, there's been a very large increase in the pay of CEOs over the last 10 or 12 years in the UK, and it's absolutely right that if you just look at the increase in pay of CEOs and you compare it to stock market performance, they're completely misaligned. Unfortunately, there's 2 or 3 reasons why you can't actually make that comparison. First is there's been a major change in the composition of these FTSE firms. The second is it doesn't include dividends and reinvested dividends. When you do that, the gap narrows. But nevertheless, you've had this this divergence, and you've also had a number of well-publicised cases of rewards for failures. There's a few every month almost, so you clearly have a problem there. The system isn't working in that respect. So what I think needs to be done really is you've got to empower shareholders. You've got to make shareholders vote binding on compensation. But you need to go further. You need to make the board more representative of the owners. You've got to empower the capitalists really. And the way to do that almost certainly is to get special corporate governance directors, special remuneration directors to start to emerge, and for the directors to have to pitch directly to shareholders, and for the shareholders to directly appoint them to boards. So in effect, have outside shareholder directors and shareholder control directors on boards. And I think if that happens, and then if they've got to stand up once a year at AGMs and explain to shareholders, things like the pay decisions for the board, I think that would shift the debate quite significantly. And I think that would be the single most powerful change you can make, in addition to making these votes binding and so on, to rebalancing what's going on there. But nonetheless, I mean, so you need to have these reforms. You also, I also think that if you did that kind of process, it would make sense, obviously, for these corporate governance directors to come up with no rewards or failures contracts. It'd be almost unthinkable if you've got enormous professionals who are actually whose sole purpose is to justify themselves to shareholders on pay, that they would come up with contracts that include rewards for failures. On the other hand, you've got a couple of issues here. You've got unfair dismissal law. You can't just fire a CEO and give him nothing. They could just simply sue you for unfair dismissal. So you probably need to change the law in that respect. I think it's very desirable that CEOs on contracts where they can be fired with no payoffs, crucially. And I think it's also very desirable that you have pay over time with these so-called clawback mechanisms. It's a slightly wrong term, because you're not really clawing the money back. You're not generally taking it out of their bank account, but what you're doing is you're paying it over time, or you put it in an escrow account and that sort of thing. That makes sense. If performance suddenly changes retroactively because of decisions you made. All these are sort of common sense changes to make sure that the incentive structure works better. But nonetheless, I'm not convinced by some of the statistics used to suggest the degree of cronyism that's going on, or to suggest that the pay has increased in the last few years as much as people think. So, as you pointed out, if you take the median earnings of CEOs of FTSE 100 companies, for 2010-11, they were up by about 14% or so. And quite interestingly enough, that of course was backward-looking. That was for the most recent sets of performance. And it was backward-looking to a performance to a year where earnings per share, i.e. 2010, right, earnings per share went up 39%, and the FTSE 100 went up by 9%. Of that 14% or so increase in total pay, all of it really came from bonuses or from long-term incentive plans that vested in the year, and that were based either on earnings per share's performance or on stock market performance. So when I look at the data for that year at least, and probably the last 2 or 3 years, I see much less much less of a situation where rewards are just surging and performance isn't. This idea that pay went up by 49% is just based on dodgy statistics. The idea that pay went up by 49%, given last year's performance where the stock market fell, is again incorrect, because it's not measuring the same time period. It's not comparing the performance time with the outcome. So I think when one starts to look at these kinds of things, one sees that I think it appears that shareholders have become quite a lot more activist over the last few years. And it does appear that the contract and so on are more aligning incentives with performance. Now you could argue that it's a wrong incentive measures, maybe they shouldn't be focusing on 1 year's earning per share measures and all that sort of stuff. You can make all these arguments. But I just don't think that the situation in the last few years has been as crazy as people say it has been. Secondly, this idea that the whole thing is a total stitch-up, total crony capitalism, and all executive directors are just simply sitting on other boards, including as compensation on the compensation committees, is again not borne out by the facts. The overwhelming majority of FTSE 100 executive directors don't actually have another directorship on another FTSE 100 company at all. 18% don't. And there's only 18 executive directors at the moment that sit on compensation on remuneration committees of other FTSE 100 companies. I mean, so you've got a few bits and pieces of that going on, and you've got a few directors who sit on 4 boards and so on. But when it comes to executive directors, this idea that executives, right, are awarding each other large pay rises in a closed shop in a crony capitalist system, look at the data when it comes to boards. That doesn't really exist at all. Now, of course, you might argue that the pool of directors is too narrow. There's all sorts of arguments you can make about problems in the world and in the boardroom and so on, and I share some of them. But I just think that, again, the debates spiral out of control here with exaggerated facts and sort of dangerous scaremongering almost. Now, okay, so let's just go back to the idea that the pay performance exploded over the last few years, but the stock market price hasn't. As I said before, there's problems comparing these things. But I think that there is, and you alluded to it before, there has been a very large increase in the size of most of these companies. And it does seem that when you look at the resources created by a company, a certain percentage tends to be allocated to wages, a certain percentage tends to be allocated to capital, and for the economists to hold something like 2/3 go to wages or something like that. It's basically a basic fact of all of these organisations, that the bigger they get, the bigger the pool for wages, which is probably one of the reasons why pay has gone up in all of this. But look, I'm not justifying how the system currently works. I think it needs quite serious reform. I think you need to empower shareholders quite substantially. You need to empower them as much as possible via simple mechanisms whereby they can quite easily make decisions and have their own people setting these kinds of things. You can't expect all shareholders to have a lot of time to get involved. One of the counterpoints of wanting to reduce the pay, for example, of fund managers is actually that's already happening in some areas. For example, a lot of people are now investing in exchange-traded funds, right? So they're moving the money out of these fund managers, be they sort of active things like hedge funds or long-only funds, where the management takes a serious percentage. They're moving their money instead to exchange-traded funds, which are very low-cost funds. So if you do that sort of stuff and you're moving towards tracker funds and all that kind of thing, it's going to be much harder for these people to actually be activists. So what you need to do is, for example, with the suggestion I came up with, this idea that you have these directors coming forward, these specialist directors, maybe even employed by special remuneration forms, that pitch to shareholders, to those shareholders that do want to get involved, to become the board directors in charge of compensation. I think that would circumvent this kind of stuff. You only need 30–40% of shareholders, or even less, to be interested, to pay an interest for this sort of thing to happen. However, once you've done that, I think you get fewer rewards for failure. You said you might occasionally get some, but I think you get fewer and you get much better aligned incentives. But are you going to get a collapse in executive pay? I don't think you are. You might get a slight decline over the next few years, but I think there's just these big forces such as growth. The fact is so many FTSE 100 companies are barely British. You know, they are sort of giant mining companies that have just floated in London and so on. You've got all these sorts of forces that I doubt is going to lead to a massive decline in pay, but I hope that it leads to pay that's really much more closely aligned to performance. And personally, I think rather than bemoan the fact that bonuses are taking an ever bigger part of compensation, I'd almost abolish sort of basic pay, and I'd almost only have variable pay, and I'd come up, if I were the one designing a contract, you'd have a system whereby it's all based on performance over a 3-year period, for example, when it comes to a few metrics, and that pay becomes very, very variable over time. And there's nothing more despicable than reward for failure. It's obviously something very important, and that anyone who cares about capitalism has to fight reward for failure. So you've got to set up the institutional system to try and reduce these rewards for failure. But I'll just put in one caveat again. As ever, the system is more complicated than people think. There's such a thing as a suicide mission. And there's cases when, you know, companies are lost cause, you might want to give someone a golden parachute because otherwise no one will want to actually take the risk and come on board. So you've got a few exceptions like that. But obviously these are not Fred Goodwin exceptions or the Thomas Cook exceptions or any of those where clearly you had a disastrous corporate performance and you had a disastrous contract. You know, just a flawed incentive structure that basically allowed these sorts of massively damaging payoffs to take place over time. And I'll just make one last point. I think one of the many problems in the current debate is the fact that the coalition loves entrepreneurs now. So if you're an entrepreneur, you pay 10% tax on your first £10 million if you save a company, which is a very, very, very good incentive. But I feel it's something slightly weird. It's almost like the first employee in the company is a god, but the second employee, the CEO, is hated. And I think that's a bit of a mistake. I love entrepreneurs, and I think they are incredibly important and the source of a lot of progress. They're not the source of all progress. And you can be a CEO and create a lot, you can be an employee, an external person who comes in, and you can create a huge amount of value for a company, for its owners. And therefore, this idea that one has to be much, much harsher on external employees than on entrepreneurs, I think is a bit wrong, a bit misguided here. But anyway, and can I just make one other point? The bit about criminalising these criminal policies, in theory, of course, that might be a good thing. However, I'm quite nervous about criminalising failure. I'm more in favour of criminalising extreme negligence if there is really such a thing that can be identified objectively. But making a mistake, thinking that something is a right decision when it's a wrong decision, I think it should not be criminalised. And I worry that we might be going down that road where basically no decision will be taken anymore. We have lawyers in every board meetings, you know, and everyone will be, you know. I think that could be debilitating. And I think the US system goes too far towards criminalising certain things sometimes. In other respects, there might be something to learn from part of it. But I think let's be careful if we're going to criminalise genuine mistakes. Right? If you take, you know, companies go bust all the time, hundreds of thousands of companies go bust every year. Capitalism is about success and failure. You can't banish failure. Failure is a good thing because it sends out the right signal. There hasn't been enough failure over the last few years. There's been too many bailouts and too much protection of bad errors. It's just part of the system. If you criminalise failure, you're going to end up with you could end up with stagnation and risk-free society as opposed to an excessively risky society. So I think that's just my little word of warning here. But I would just urge everybody who's interested in this debate to look at there's several interpretations of the facts, and just look at the facts. But I agree that's substantial reforms needed. So anyway, thank you.
Right, well, thank you very much for, I think, 3 excellent contributions. We're going to open to Q&A now. I'm going to take chairman's prerogative and ask the first one, and then we'll take them in batches of 3. And this is probably, I guess, for Zoe to start with first, because you put the idea of bringing employees onto the board. Yeah, perhaps you put the case for that. Why do we need employees on the board, or can shareholders do a job on their own?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned before, the Commission concluded that employees had an important role to play in the success of the company. They have often a very long-term interest in the company. They often, it is the only place they work, and their sole source of income. And that means that actually, when you compare them to a shareholder who has a spread over the FTSE and perhaps 0.1% in the whole range of companies, they have actually a greater investment in that company than any shareholder would. So they have a real interest. Would they have something useful to add is the next question. Well, quite often workers know a lot more about what is going on in a company than the owners, the shareholders, could ever do. In terms of would they have a useful contribution in terms of remuneration, I think they probably would. You would have someone proposing a £1 million salary plus a bonus which would perhaps be 90% of salary, so 2 million potential bonus, plus a long-term incentive plan, which would again, they can be up to 300% of salary if you meet all of the criteria. It's important to add that. You would have to look an employee who's on average pay in the eye and say, this is what we think this executive deserves, and we think they deserve it for X, Y, Z reason, and we want to go ahead and do it. And I think that if you had to do that with every remuneration decision that you made, maybe it would inject a sort of slightly more sense of realism in what you can make.
Well, I think that the principle that anybody who's on a remuneration committee shouldn't be deciding on the pay of themselves or of anybody who defines their pay is an extremely important one. And as Alistair said, the problem is more that of a culture of a relatively small group of people on remuneration committees rather than the direct reciprocity. And so I don't think that this is in any sense a silver bullet or would make much of a difference really. I'm more interested in things that will work to change the way that that rewards are handed out. I think that it's important that we do it in a way that strengthens the economy and so gets incentives right for management to build businesses and grow businesses, rather than doing things because of the politics. So I think there's other things that I concentrate on, like getting rid of golden parachutes, for instance, which is vital. I was very amused in what you were saying, Alistair, about I got the impression that you thought that the FA wouldn't have been able to find an England manager if they hadn't given Fabio Capello a golden parachute. But I'm sure there's plenty of people who would have put their hands up.
I wasn't specifically singling anyone out. I just think there's always more complexities to this thing than black and white picture. That was my only point on that. In terms of it's so-called employees on boards, one thing that I find quite amusing would be the idea of an investment bank, and what would happen if you put one of their traders on the board and asked him to decide on compensation. But anyway, that's just my joke. I'm opposed to that because I don't think that's the way the system should work. I think pay should be determined by the owners in the final respect, not by anybody else, and especially not by employees, or as commonly understood. And I'm not against I also oppose to publishing ratios, by the way, between lower paid and higher paid. I am not campaigning against, I'm not campaigning for greater egalitarianism. I'm campaigning for a compensation mechanism that hopefully is more efficient, reduces payment for error, and which hopefully incentivizes people to produce value for shareholders.
We've got Mike. One here, there, and let's start. I'll take 3 at a time.
I just wanted to ask about who would select this employee representative. Would it be the employees themselves, in which case there would have to be a mechanism to ensure this? Or indeed, would it be the directors or people in the remuneration committee to choose somebody? I think that would be an interesting thought as to how it might work in practice.
As Alistair said, I think this is a very complicated issue, and one of the interesting things for me is that the government's occasionally steer clear in sending opposition politicians and steering clearer to some unhelpful rhetoric. But then, on the other hand, there are some policies the government have done which have pushed up executive pay. So quantitative easing, for example, boosted asset prices, which then meant that executives were being rewarded not because companies had gone up in value, but because of the sort of the way that it worked through the system. And I thought that there are some policies around, obviously around the way that the banks were bailed out, that the implicit guarantee that means that bankers get paid more, top executives compare themselves to top bankers, etc. All those things have sort of been absent from the debate, particularly in some sense. I would ask Zoe about that, because it's almost more of a left-wing view, I think, to try and say government should stop doing all the, point out the government failures where they're making it worse, rather than just sort of attacking success.
So my name is David Watson. I'm the founder and the chair of the shareholder activist and engagement group at Hermes, and have been for a number of years. So I guess I'm responsible for having got us into this fine mess. But a lot of talk about shareholders and how it is we get the system to work. I'd really have a sort of a couple of comments and questions from them. I mean, the first would be, I think it's absolutely terrific that we're having the debate, and I think, Matthew, in particular, where you started off in terms of what we should try to do with markets has to be absolutely right for the right of centre, and actually for the left of centre as well. I worry, though, having been involved in this debate for 20 years, about trying to find one single solution, or even 5 single solutions that would get a headline. We have dramatically reformed the way we go about thinking about executive pay and other parts of shareholder responsibility over the past 20 years. Actually, I think it's done some good, but it's clearly not solved the problem. We might want to think about how we build on what's already been done, rather than disappearing in another direction. And if I had a sort of steer that I put on this, it comes from some work we've recently been doing at the International Corporate Governance Network, which is a global body of professionals involved in corporate governance. And a group of us, group of them, wrote this absolutely superb piece, 40 pages long, of how it is as a shareholder you can see compensation packages that are designed to reward failure and don't contract right and all the rest of it. And so we had a debate about it at the board, and we said, okay, well, where is it that these very complex contracts are most prevalent? And of course it's in the United States. Britain follows a distant second. And where is it that we've got executive compensation most out of hand? And it's in the United States. And it's not that this is just a principal agent problem, if I can get economically about it. This is a problem of asymmetric information. That actually the people who are doing the work know much more about what they're doing and how it is that they can get paid than the people that are offering them the pay. And we do have mechanisms for overcoming this. For example, we have it with doctors or with parents or with other people. We call it that you owe a fiduciary duty. That there is a limit to the amount that you can profit by the amount more that you know than the people that you're working for. And the people that you're working for, as Matthew rightly said, are millions upon millions of people all over the world in pensions and own the shares in British companies. And I wonder whether there might be mileage in thinking about how it is that through the system we could be strengthening the notion of the fiduciary role of the fund manager, of the pension fund, of the board of directors, indeed of the employee, to the millions and millions of shareholders for whom they're supposed to be working and from whom they are not supposed unduly to be profiting.
Can I answer that? Can I ask further questions as well and take the questions in reverse order, because I think that I entirely agree that there is no one rule change that will change this, and that it's more a matter of culture, and of course rules form culture. But I would challenge whether that culture has been successfully changed enough, because after all we are getting every week examples of gross rewards for failure, with Thomas Cook in the news last week, and the RBS contract signed off in 2009 in the news this week. So I don't think that the culture is in the right place at all. But I do agree entirely with you on the question of asymmetric information, and our proposal of the public protagonist is intended precisely to deal with asymmetric information. The transparency proposals of the government are strong, and in particular about simplifying pay structures in order to promote enable people to understand them better. So I think that's important. But I don't think that we can entirely get there without changes to the rules. And I don't think that, I think that there are changes that are going to be needed. And this brings me to the next point, which is that, of course, all sorts of macroeconomic policies have an impact around the economy, but they're done for good macroeconomic reasons. And you can argue for or against QE, but I think trying to argue against QE on the grounds of the impact on executive remuneration is a bit, it's quite a leap. But I just wanted to also respond to something I didn't get the chance to from Alistair, which is about the proposal for the gross negligence offence. I agree it's very important that we don't criminalise business decisions, but instead make sure that there is a duty. That's why I proposed a duty on valuation, because I'm sure you'll agree in the run-up to the crash there were some valuations that were made that were not reasonable on any sense of the word, and we've got to be very clear about what it is that we're giving the duty to do that you can then be negligent of. And I agree that it's important not to criminalise a business judgment, but I specifically proposed this offence for systemically important financial institutions, which I think is which was done because these are the institutions whose failure affects the wider economy. So your broader argument that we should allow every institution to fail, I wish were true, but for systemically important banks it isn't. And I don't think that, and I think it's really vitally important that these parts of the plumbing of the financial system are run in a way that doesn't bring down the rest of the economy. And responding to Lord Risby's point, all I would do is add another question, which is who would set the pay of the employee who would be setting the management's pay? Do you get management to set the pay of the employee who's setting management's pay? That's a question that needs an answer.
I was deliberately not getting into the economic crisis, the bubble, the financial crisis, because I think that's a massive and very exciting and interesting discussion, but it could easily hijack this entire meeting, which the way I understand is about executive pay, i.e. the pay of senior born executives on the top few hundred listed companies. But nonetheless, I mean, I still worry slightly that you're trying to ban bubbles by law, by trying to put this valuation point. But anyway,
as you'll know from having read my book, I don't think it's possible to end bubbles and end boom and bust.
Right. Anyway, but we could talk about.
I'm sure you read the free copy I sent.
Of course I did. But I didn't write a review. Maybe I should, but maybe not.
Not too late.
Yes, but going back to what you were saying, obviously I do think that if you're in a bubble, and the pay, as a result of the bubble, the pay of certain people who are competitors to board-level executives goes up significantly and unsustainably, as we've seen, because at the moment the pay, the total compensation of people at Goldman Sachs and others is collapsing at the moment, as is the numbers of employees. So obviously, at the height of the bubble, those people, their salaries were obviously seen in part as peer-level salaries, and obviously you had issues there. Same thing, the bubble for private equity, which meant again you could hire salaries artificially, and so on. So clearly, a credit bubble will create fake resources, some of which will get allocated to executives and therefore push up more wages. So I think that's one of the reasons why the wages went up too much over the last few years, though that pressure doesn't particularly exist anymore now. I mean, you used to have that pressure in banks, they all went to hedge funds and so on, so the banks had to keep putting up the wages and things like that. So clearly you have those sorts of pressures as part of this picture. I've said, I accept, and I think that wages grew too much over the past 10 years. And I think it's not by too much as the figures might indicate for some of the reasons I said. For example, some of the companies have expanded substantially in size, the different set of companies, and so on. But I think ultimately, there's constantly slightly diffuse messages. On the one hand, there's this issue about rules for failure, i.e. people leaving companies with large amounts of money after having failed, and this separate issue of rewards overall and aligning rewards generally to performance in good times. So I think they're slightly different messages, and because they require slightly different approaches. I think that it's quite clear that apart from this suicide scenario I outlined, which we had a discussion about, I think rules of failure are basically completely wrong. So, but I think in general rules of failure are wrong throughout society. I think people who fail should be fired without a payoff. The problem we've got now is most sackings are accompanied by a payoff. Sackings at the top are accompanied by very, very large payoffs. There's no way you're going to go through a disciplinary committee for a CEO. There's no way that for 6 months or 9 months a CEO is going to be having to go to meetings every 3 weeks, and bring in his employment lawyer and all that sort of stuff, right? What's going to happen is he's going to be fired. There's going to be a boardroom coup. So what you need to do is you need to facilitate boardroom coups without massive compensation.
How would, sorry, I missed your name. How would the employee representative be selected? Well, there are a range of mechanisms you could use. They could be elected by the employees. They could be elected by a set of colleges. For example, one electoral college could be the employees, one could be the shareholders, and one could be the customers of the business. There are a range of options you could do. Would the executive then set the pay of the employee? Yes, they probably would. But they would do that within a company pay structure, which you would hope would be fair. Do macroeconomic policies have effects on remuneration? Of course they do. Does it mean they're necessarily that we should be particularly focused on those? I think perhaps not. I think we should, in this area, be more concerned about the unforeseen consequences of action. So my favourite example is the bonus tax, which has resulted in bankers getting double their previous salaries. I think that this is an area where you are absolutely right. We need to see a cultural shift. One executive we went and saw said that until you won't deal with this problem until all executives genuinely have to say or want to say that they don't want to be paid that much, because you will always get special pleading, and every special pleading results in a ratchet across the board, across the pond. I think that one point I would like to make is this point on cronyism, which has been said by David Cameron and others. We did not describe it as cronyism because there is a difficulty with the sort of feedback mechanism, because while an executive in a FTSE 100 company may sit on a remuneration committee of another FTSE 100 company, the executive of that company does not then sit on theirs. However, we did draw attention, and this is an area we're very concerned about, with the relatively small gene pool that makes up most remuneration committees. They are largely either current CEOs, either ex-CEOs, or quite often investment bankers, and they come from a very specific business executive employee background, they are generally male, they are wonderfully white. And I think this gives a certain tint to the decisions which they make. So while it may not be cronyism, with the benchmarking process, there is definitely a problem going on there. I think I've covered most of the questions.
It's really warm. At the very back, then one row up from there, and then maybe there.
Thank you very much. So I'm Roger Grake, I'm a filmmaker and a criminologist, and I've made a number of films at boardroom level and multinationals and so on, following decisions. And I agree with Alistair that decisions are very difficult. You might make a mistake and they certainly shouldn't be criminalised. But on the other hand, part of the whole function of the justice system is to have people take responsibility for their actions. And that's something we try to teach young people. And it seems to me the culture change you've talked about is partly the fact that people seem to have forgotten to take responsibility for their actions. And that's a symbolic statement about the difference between people at the top of business and so on, and the rest of the population. And I think that's very bad for the social contract, certainly bad for big society. But in terms of the quote you're quoting from Milton Friedman, it's also against ethical and moral codes of the rest of society. And it seems to me rather puzzling, and the culture change we're talking about, that this should happen in a situation where not only is industry struggling, but also when Japanese, and you mentioned Chinese bank, which is very, very interesting, Japanese business came in here. I remember in the Northeast, I think it was Honda, came in with 10 times at the top to the bottom. That's the ratio, 10 times the worst paid. And everybody kept saying, this is amazing. But somehow people have lost sight of that. And the last thing, which is a proper question for the panel, is about tax. You haven't mentioned tax, nobody mentioned tax. But there's a sense in which one sees the Vodafone and other decisions, and you know, the idea that somehow the IRS treats, or the revenue treats people differently if they're at the top and they're making zillions. That's all part of this cultural problem, I think, for business. And I very much, you know, wish you well with these propositions, but I think there's a disconnect now that's a problem that has to be addressed between the people getting all this money who don't seem to notice what the impact is on the rest of us about it.
Hello, I'm Hannah Bullivant from Which. I wanted to ask about the PPI mis-selling scandal, which resulted in losses for consumers of billions of pounds. But so far, the executives that resided over that scandal have got away scot-free. And I wanted to know what action the panel thinks should be taken and how it should be taken.
There's one more.
It's just really a point. Everyone, the three panel members have all agreed on one thing, which is that shareholders need to be a bigger part of the answer. And I wonder whether if it's still fashionable to look at Sweden, where in Sweden they've introduced an interesting mechanism where the largest shareholders form the nomination committee for publicly listed companies. And when we talk about getting shareholders more involved, we've got to remember that shareholders don't necessarily always want to take on this role. So something perhaps as simple as them making up the nomination committee might actually be rather a sensible thing we could take from our friends in Scandinavia.
I mean, that's quite an interesting idea. My idea is slightly different, but could match with that, which is that the remuneration, you have these specialist remuneration directors who basically pitch themselves to be the remuneration directors, or to be specific directors, and it's a bit like this issue that accountancy firms, auditors are selected by the CEO, and then the auditors have to audit the CEO. Now, okay, you've got the same situation now, obviously. If there's a way whereby the shareholders could select literally those shareholders who care, right, which might be a few big ones that own 4 or 5%, a few long-only funds, maybe an activist hedge fund, or whatever, maybe a pension fund. Those who care select the group of people who then are in charge of contracts and pay and so on. That I think would be the most powerful way of changing. It's not that different to what you're saying. Maybe slightly different, because the only slight problem with your version is if you're a small shareholder over 100 shares, you'd be disenfranchised entirely from this. Now, obviously you're in one way because your vote is tiny, but nonetheless, I think enshrining that too much might go a bit too far. But I think, yes, it doesn't matter if most shareholders don't care, if you've got a mechanism by which the shareholders who do care are just effectively allowed to take that power. And I think that's the kind of a thing we need to look at. Yeah, no, I do think that's very interesting, actually.
I think that going backwards again, across auditors, rating agencies, where you pay a rating agency to get a rating on your bond, nomination committees, remuneration committees, there is a problem of who makes the appointment and people being held to account by people who they appoint. And I do think that that could be tackled. But I'm worried about, I share Alistair's worry about changing an important principle, which is that all shareholders are equal in proportion of the shares that they own, when they own the same share type. Of course, there's different types of shares. So this is the sort of thing that I think could happen if it came from the changes in the Articles of Association of Companies, i.e. came from the companies themselves. And I hope that some FTSE companies are looking at that sort of thing. But also publishing voting behaviour and voting policies by large shareholders will advance this a long way. And since October 2010, there's been an active move to get voting policies published, and I think 230 of the largest the fund management organisations in the city now publish their voting policies. So this is an area, I think, where discussion of it and thought about it will lead to action coming from industry and groups that are set up in order to make it happen. I think that a regulatory change has some downsides, but we should consider all things. On the PPI question, I'm going to broaden it out because I think PPI is important in this field. But in the 2006 Companies Act, there were fiduciary duties of directors, including executive directors, and remember in law there's no real distinction between executive and non-executive directors. But these duties have never been tested in law, and but they're big picture, the duties as set out in that act. And they were, indeed, when the Act was brought in, they were intended as a codification of a whole series of previous duties. And it's those sorts of duties that already exist that directors should be held to. And that comes to a bigger question, which is the question of responsibility. I think this is the nub of the problem, is a lack of responsibility, a removal of thought about the link between action and consequence right across society. We saw it in the riots in the summer at amongst a different group of people. We see it in our benefit system, and we see it broadly. And I think that is a huge, deep cultural change that needs to take place. And I think that sometimes introducing a rule can remove ethical constraints that were there in the first place. And we've got to be extremely careful to handle this with knowledge and sight of how people behave, what the unintended consequences will be, how we as humans, as flawed individuals, will react to a set of changes that are brought out. And I think actually the public discourse about it makes a big impact because people examine their own lives. And I can only recommend one thing more in terms of my thinking about this, which is that I wrote a book about it. So read Masters of Nothing, it's available and buy it back for $13.99. I am a capitalist, you see.
On that, Zoe?
Yes, absolutely. Responsibility at the top has been identified by David Cameron as something he cares about, and he's absolutely right to. I think that there has been a dislocation of responsibility and action, and that's a problem. And it goes throughout our society, and I think that everyone from left to right should be concerned about that. In terms of the PPI selling scandal, I understand that there is some controversy about Eric Daniels' salary and whether that should be attempted to be clawed back. It raises a whole lot of questions about the CEO's responsibility to what has gone on before them and what goes on in the future. I think that these are important questions, and it's great that there will be a debate about this. On the nomination committee, I am not an expert on this, so I would be cautious about saying anything too conclusive, but it is certainly an interesting idea, and we do love to learn from our Scandinavian fellows. My one major concern would be that it would disenfranchise smaller shareholders, which can often
They're completely disenfranchised at the moment.
Yeah, well, but they often vote through in blocks through proxy agencies. So in that way, sometimes they do have a say. For example, you see quite a lot of local authority action in terms of voting blocks, and they might not easily not be one of the top 5 shareholders in any one company.
Right, more questions. 1, 2, and 3.
Thank you. I'm Peter Cattrall from the University of London at Queen Mary's College. The panel have all talked about the problems of people who are already in position and how that the excessive remuneration of people who are already in position may be addressed. And all the solutions we've heard relate to people who are already in post. Nobody's talked about the appointments procedure or how that might impact upon the labour market for executive pay. So I've been, without wishing to go on about my personal bugbears, such as the what seems to me to be the perverse incentives that headhunters have to drive up markets for executive pay, or indeed football agents have perverse incentives to drive up the pay of the people who they service. I'd be very interested to know what thoughts the panel have, if any, about what impact the appointments process has upon the market for executive pay. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Tim Phipps. I represent an organisation called One Society, and we're keen to promote the interests of business through tackling excesses of inequality. So I'm very pleased to hear Matt talk about the need to promote capitalism through taking on these issues. I'd like to say 2 unfashionable things in our society. The first unfashionable thing is I think we're talking too much about executive pay. Not absolutely, but relative to how little we ever talk about the pay and performance of the rest of the workforce, i.e. the performance of the entire company. The second unfashionable thing is I'd like to say something nice about banks, who have taken a lot of stick about how high their pay is at the top. But it's well to remember that they have been some of the leaders in introducing living wage policies, for example, for the people at the bottom. I wondered therefore, with an idea about that capitalism, that companies, that the economy, that taxpayers need the performance of the entire company to work properly, whether that means that employees on remuneration committees, whether ratios or indeed some other initiatives to promote a whole company holistic view should be promoted rather than just thinking, okay, how do we talk about the pay at the top?
I am Oliver Wiseman from Total Politics magazine. I'd like to ask Matthew a quick question, which is the idea of criminalisation of gross negligence amongst executives. How much area is that getting in Westminster and specifically government? What do they think of that?
Well, I'll let Zoe go first this time.
I'll just come in on the first 2 rather than the one directed specifically to you. Peter, we have been talking about people already in position, mostly. I had a meeting with David Bolchover, who writes a lot about management issues and and executive pay at the top particularly. And he has a rather good or interesting idea, which would go that a company would perhaps pick 5 people who they wanted to be their, who could potentially be their future executive, and then they recommend that they bid each other down on how much that they would do the job for. So perhaps that is a way of shifting the market significantly. In terms of having a more whole company pay policy, Duncan, I obviously think that that's important, and in fact remuneration committees do have a responsibility to consider pay across the company when they are making their decisions about executive pay. The extent to which they do this is a rather unknown factor. We can speculate, but I'll leave it at that.
I think we shouldn't forget that there is a market here. Okay, the argument may be that the market is flawed or rigged in some way, but ultimately there is a market. And the market ultimately is about supply and demand, obviously. So I'd love to boost my own pay, and but no one then says that means that the market's biased because I want to boost my own pay, right? So obviously everybody wants to maximise their pay, but I still think there's
not me.
Well, that's true. You almost want to minimise it. Oh, so do I. I'm a journalist rather than a banker. But the point, and we've all made our choices, obviously. But I was just obviously using that as an analogy. And the point is, I still think there's a number of downward pressures on pay too. I mean, it's not like there's no downward pressure on pay. It's not like there's no market. It's not like it's only about supply, not about demand, right? So we shouldn't push this whole thing too far. Obviously, headhunters have got an incentive for themselves to pay this, but so has a candidate, obviously. So the candidate incentives, the candidate's incentives and the headhunters' incentives are aligned. I think the rest of the discussion is more important in my view than some of these particular points. Just going to your point about downward bidding of pay. Again, to me, that's not the aim. Should not be to minimise pay here. The aim should be in my view, to set the right pay, the right incentives, no remorse for failure, and so on and so forth. So I'm sort of rolling back slightly from the general tenure of the whole thing. Can I throw in a sort of incredibly controversial point, which is that in some labour markets, I think there's some evidence that the people, i.e. maybe CEOs, footballers, a few others like that, look at their post-tax pay, not their pre-tax pay. And it may even be that higher marginal tax rates, to a certain degree, and in the short term, may actually push up nominal pay. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Brilliant. Alice always manages to find an argument against the 50p rate in any discussion, so I'm glad that you achieved it today as well.
It's just an illustration of, I think there's very complex economic forces in all of this.
Yeah, I think that on the question of the ratchet up, I do think this has been a problem, and particularly because one of the problems is that the more rules you put on remuneration committees, the more likely they are to go to have so-called independent consultants to sign off their decision to cover their backs. But we've got to look very closely at who these remuneration consultants are, and often we've seen this in the public sector and the private sector. For instance, in the market for council chief executives, which absolutely shot up over the past decade and is now starting to come down. But all economists know that pay tends to be sticky downwards, and there's a good reason for that, which is that people have loss aversion, and there's a lot of evidence of loss aversion. So it's far harder to cut somebody's pay compared to the ease with which it's put up. And so this ratchet often happens because a remuneration consultant will look at the most recent appointment to a similar size board or executive position, and then add a small margin and suggest that as an appropriate pay level. And then the next one will look at that as the most recent example and add a small margin, and we can all see where that goes. And so, especially when there's been a boom that can't last forever, that's increased pay elsewhere, for instance, because people are taking capital gains as income in the most sophisticated sense, as in because they're in asset markets and their performance translates into income. In a competitive market with people who are in stewardship positions as opposed to trading positions, I think that the concept of stewardship is very important, especially in our systemically important institutions. Then you do get this ratchet, and we need to look very closely at remuneration consultants. Remuneration consultants also are involved in the question about a living wage. I think actually the argument you made is one of the arguments that shows why publishing pay ratios, whilst I'm generally in favour of transparency, I don't think is going to tell us everything, because, for instance, in the Prime Minister used the example, in Goldman Sachs, the pay ratio is likely to be lower than in Tesco because of the nature of the average employee and the job that the average employee does, and so the ratio between the average pay and the top pay will not give you the result that people are necessarily looking for in terms of transparency. And finally, on the question of on whether criminality is being looked at in government, you have to ask the government. They are. I saw that somebody from the Treasury told the Mail on Sunday that something in this area. They seem to have been asked the question, but that will be for your journalistic skills.
Cool. We said we'd wrap it up by 2 o'clock, so I'd just like to thank the panelists for what I think was a fantastic Q&A and some very interesting speeches as well. So thank you very much indeed. And then I'd just like to, one last thing I'd pick up out of it is that clearly there's from my perspective, a need and scope for much more research, despite the work that Zoe's done. So I think that's what we'll be taking forward at Post Exchange. So thank you once again.